When you stop and think about how fast everything changes these days, I mean, technology, information overload,
Yeah.
it feels like being able to learn on your own, adapt.
Mm.
It's not just nice to have, it's essential.
Right, absolutely. It's becoming a core skill for navigating, well, everything.
And what's really interesting is that this skill, self-regulated learning, SRL they call it, it seems like the groundwork for it gets laid really early, like elementary school early.
That's exactly what we're diving into today. We're looking at the connection between those early teacher-student interactions and how kids develop this capacity to learn independently.
Right. And we're basing this on some pretty solid research.
Yeah, we're drawing heavily from a big review study. It's called Stimulating Elementary School Students' Self-Regulated Learning Through High-Quality Interactions and Relationships, a narrative review.
Okay.
And what's great is it synthesizes findings from 30 different studies. So it gives a really broad picture of what's happening during those crucial elementary years.
30 studies. Wow. Okay. So when we talk about SRL for these younger kids, elementary age, wh- what does that actually involve? What are we, looking for?
Well, for them, it's really about learning to steer their own learning ship, so to
Yeah.
speak. It involves things like paying attention to whether they're understanding something, that's the metacognition piece,
Yeah.
and using specific strategies to learn better, that's cognition. But it also includes their motivation, their drive, and managing their feelings about learning, their emotions, and even their behavior, like organizing their stuff or knowing when to ask the teacher for help. The general idea is kids who get good at this stuff tend to do better in school and are just more engaged learners overall.
So they're kind of learning to manage the whole process themselves. Now, I feel like some people might think, elementary kids, maybe they're just too young for that kind of self-direction.
Yeah, that's a common thought, but it's largely a misconception. Research shows they can regulate their learning maybe at a more basic level initially, but they can. And this ability really grows and gets more complex throughout elementary school. So it's actually a critical time for developing these SRL foundations.
So that's our mission for this deep dive then, to unpack what these 30 studies tell us about how teacher interactions, both like the whole class vibe and those one-on-one relationships, link up with all these different parts of learning to learn on your own.
Exactly. We want to see what the research landscape looks like, what we know about how teachers can effectively support these, honestly, really vital skills.
Okay, great.
Mhm.
So maybe before we jump into the classroom specifics and the dyadic stuff, could we just briefly touch on the theory behind SRL? What are the sort of core ideas?
Sure. At its heart, SRL is usually seen as this active, goal-oriented process. Students aren't just, soaking up information passively.
Right.
They're meant to be actively monitoring how things are going, regulating their approach, making changes to their strategies to hit their learning targets.
So that active role, that agency is really the key piece.
Precisely. And while there are various models out there, most researchers land on a few key components. Motivation is a big one, their desire to learn, their confidence. Then there's cognition, the actual learning strategies they use, like memorization techniques or how they organize information. And metacognition, thinking about their own thinking, planning, checking their understanding.
Those three sound like the classic trio, but I think the review mentioned a couple of others that are maybe especially important for younger kids.
Yes, exactly. For this age group, regulating emotions and regulating behavior are also seen as really critical. Emotion regulation is about handling feelings, like, say, getting frustrated with a hard math problem or feeling anxious before a presentation.
Okay.
And behavior regulation covers things like managing time, staying focused, persisting when it's tough, and knowing how and when to ask for help appropriately. The review really emphasizes these two for elementary success.
So for younger students, it's not just about the thinking part, but also managing feelings and actions around learning, a broader picture.
You got it. And, some theories talk about SRL in cycles like planning, doing, reflecting. But this review kind of organizes things around those 5 components: motivation, cognition, metacognition, emotion, and behavior.
Why that approach?
It just provides a more consistent way to look across the 30 studies. Given that researchers sometimes define those cyclical phases a little differently, it focuses on the core elements.
Makes sense.
There-
Okay, let's get into the classroom level then. How does the overall environment, the teacher's interactions with the whole class, shape these SRL skills?
This is where a framework called the Teaching Through Interactions Framework, or TTI, comes in really handy. It's a well-regarded way to analyze classroom-level interaction quality. It basically breaks it down into 3 main domains.
Okay, what are they?
First up is instructional support. This is all about the teaching itself, how teachers encourage kids to think critically, if they use different teaching methods, the kind of feedback they give, how well they foster deep understanding.
So the quality of the actual instruction and how engaging it is?
Exactly. The second domain is classroom organization. This looks at classroom management, clear rules, smooth routines, making sure learning time isn't wasted, basically keeping things running efficiently.
Got it. The structure and flow of the classroom.
And the third is emotional support. This is about the classroom climate. Is it positive, warm? Is the teacher sensitive to students' needs and perspectives? Do they respect student ideas? Do kids get some say, some autonomy?
Creating that safe, supportive space.
Right. Yeah. And the TTI framework suggests each of these areas impacts SRL development. High-quality instruction, for instance, is thought to build cognitive and metacognitive skills by challenging students and giving them practice.
And did the review find support for that? I think you mentioned something about explicitly teaching strategies.
Yes, it did. There was a positive link found when teachers explicitly taught learning strategies, cognitive, metacognitive, even motivational ones. This seemed especially helpful in the early grades, kind of laying that foundation.
Interesting. So being direct about how to learn helps. What about classroom organization? How does a well-run class help SRL?
The thinking here is that it helps students focus their attention and effort better. Less chaos, more time on task, right? Plus, an organized teacher might model that kind of regulated behavior, and a structured setting might just allow students to benefit more from the instruction itself.
Okay, so structure frees up mental space for learning and emotional support.
Well, if kids feel safe and encouraged, they're more likely to take risks, try hard things, and persist. This could boost motivation, behavior regulation, and maybe even help them manage learning-related anxiety.
Right.
There's also a suggestion it might help develop executive functions, which are tied into cognitive regulation.
So it really sounds like all three,
Yep.
instruction, organization, emotional support, work together at the classroom level. But what did the actual studies find? Let's break it down by SRL component. What about regulation of cognition using learning strategies?
Yeah, surprisingly, only 2 studies looked directly at this link at the classroom level. One hinted that scaffolding and emotional support might help cognitive regulation,
Okay.
but another suggested some kinds of feedback might actually reduce students' interest in deeper learning. So honestly, the evidence here is pretty thin right now.
That is surprising. You'd assume good teaching directly impacts strategy use. Okay, what about metacognition, thinking about thinking?
Here, things were a bit clearer. Several studies linked instructional support, especially good feedback, scaffolding, explicit strategy teaching positively with students' metacognitive skills.
That makes intuitive sense.
Yeah, and there was some initial evidence that classroom organization and emotional support might also play a role, perhaps just not quite as strongly as instructional support for metacognition specifically.
Okay, so actively guiding how students think about learning seems key for metacognition. What did the review say about regulating motivation at the classroom level?
Motivation. This was where the findings got pretty mixed, really inconsistent actually. Some studies found links, like aspects of instructional support, like focusing on achievement, classroom organization, good management structure, and emotional support, autonomy, involvement, seemed linked to motivation in some cases. But other studies found no significant links or even negative ones. So it's complex. It might depend heavily on how these things are done or how motivation is measured. Maybe a super rigid structure kills motivation, even though it's organized. The studies might not capture those nuances.
Right, the specifics of implementation really matter. Okay, and regulation of behavior, was that also mixed?
Pretty much, yeah. Also inconsistent findings. Some studies suggested that when kids perceived more instructional and emotional support and better organization, they showed more behavioral engagement.
Okay, perception matters.
But then other studies, maybe using direct observation or different measures, didn't find those same links. So again, it could be down to the methods, the age of the kids, lots of factors.
So, summing up the classroom level, strong instructional support seems pretty consistently good for metacognition. But for motivation and behavior, the overall classroom environment picture is, well, murkier.
That's a fair summary, yes. More complicated there.
All right, let's shift gears then. What about those individual one-on-one teacher-student relationships, the dyadic interactions? How do they play into SRL?
Yeah, the quality of that specific relationship matters too. The review looks at this through 3 main dimensions. First is closeness, warmth, supportiveness, that connection.
Okay.
Second is conflict, negativity, friction, discord in the relationship.
Right.
And third is dependency, where a student relies maybe too heavily on the teacher.
And you can immediately see how those different flavors of relationship might affect a kid's learning, right?
Absolutely. A close, warm relationship that can build emotional security, help kids feel capable as learners. That could definitely boost motivation, behavior, maybe even emotion regulation. But conflict or high dependency, that could increase stress, maybe make kids less willing to engage or stick with hard tasks, hindering SRL.
So that individual bond can be a real anchor, or the opposite.
Yeah.
What did the specific studies find here? Let's start with regulation of cognition and the strategy use.
Well, just like at the classroom level for this specific component, the review found basically nothing. No studies specifically looked at the link between dyadic relationship quality and cognitive regulation.
Another gap then. Interesting.
Definitely an area for future research.
Okay, so no data on strategy use. What about metacognition at the dyadic level?
Here, there were two studies. They suggested that closer relationships were linked to better metacognitive skills, and conversely, more conflict seemed related to lower levels of some metacognitive behaviors.
So that positive individual connection seems to help kids manage their learning better, while conflict might hurt it. What about motivation in these one-on-one relationships?
This was actually much more consistent than the classroom-level findings for motivation.
Oh, really? How so?
Several studies consistently showed that closer relationships were linked to more positive attitudes about school, higher motivation, and conflict was pretty consistently linked to lower motivation.
That seems clear.
Yeah. There was less on dependency, but what little there was suggested it might relate to lower intrinsic motivation, which makes sense if you're always relying on the teacher.
Right. Less internal drive.
Yeah.
And finally, behavior regulation and dyadic relationships.
Also more consistent than the classroom findings, conflict seemed pretty clearly linked to poorer behavioral regulation,
Okay.
and closeness generally predicted better behavioral engagement. Though one study found this might change slightly for older elementary kids, suggesting maybe the influence evolves a bit with age.
So overall, for the dyadic level, it looks like that individual relationship quality has a pretty solid connection to motivation and behavior regulation, and maybe metacognition too. Much clearer than the classroom level picture for those aspects.
That seems to be what the bulk of the reviewed research suggests, yes.
Now, the review didn't just summarize findings, it also pointed out limitations and where research needs to go next. What were some key gaps?
A big one was the heavy reliance on student self-reports for measuring SRL. Questionnaires where kids rate themselves.
Right. And the problem there is?
Well, kids, especially younger ones, might not be the most accurate reporters of their own internal processes or behaviors. What they think they do might differ from reality.
It makes sense.
So the review strongly suggests using more diverse methods like classroom observations, teacher reports, maybe even interviews to get a richer, more triangulated picture. Something maybe listeners involved in education could think about. How do we really see these skills in action?
Yeah, getting multiple angles. They also mentioned a lack of research with the youngest kids.
Yes, another critical point. Kids in kindergarten or first grade often struggle with complex questionnaires, so we need methods better suited for them, maybe more observational approaches.
Tailoring the tools.
What else? Also, that SRL measures often just look at strategy use, maybe missing the bigger picture of SRL, and the potential mismatch between teacher and student perspectives on their relationship and the student's SRL getting both views is important.
That difference in perception could be huge.
Yeah.
One thing that really jumped out at me was the lack of research on emotional regulation, given how important we know emotions are for learning.
Absolutely. That was a major gap highlighted. We talk about anxiety, frustration, engagement, but there's very little research directly connecting teacher interactions, either classroom-wide or one-on-one, to how students actually learn to manage those learning-related emotions.
It feels like a massive blind spot.
It really does. It's a crucial area for future work, and perhaps something for listeners to reflect on, too. How do we support that emotional piece?
Definitely. Any other major gaps mentioned?
Yes, a few more. Limited work on student dependency and its effects. Also, most studies look at SRL overall, not necessarily how interactions support different phases of learning, like planning versus reflecting. And a really big one. The vast majority of research is from Western countries. We know very little about how these dynamics play out in different cultural contexts. Are the findings universal? We just don't know yet.
So we need to broaden the cultural lens significantly.
Exactly. These gaps show that while we've learned a lot, there's still so much more to figure out about nurturing these self-regulation skills effectively.
Well, this has been incredibly insightful. So if we try to boil it down, key takeaways might be classroom-level instructional support looks pretty key for metacognition.
Mm-hmm.
And those positive, close individual relationships seem reliably linked to better motivation and behavior. But for other SRL aspects, or looking just at the overall classroom climate, the picture's definitely more complex, right?
That sums it up nicely. Both the big picture environment and the personal connections matter, but maybe in different ways for different aspects of SRL. And clearly, high-quality interactions in both contexts are beneficial.
Absolutely. And it leaves us with so much to think about for future research. Emotional regulation, cultural differences,
Mm-hmm.
which leads to a final thought, perhaps. Considering how little we know about emotional regulation's link to teacher interactions and how most research is Western-focused, what might we be missing? How might different cultural norms around emotion or a student's ability to manage their feelings fundamentally shape their path to becoming a self-directed, lifelong learner?
That's a powerful question to ponder. It really highlights the complexity and the need for a broader perspective as we move forward.